So, welcome. This is just about the halfway point of the retreat, I think. Hope everybody's settling in. So we're going to continue with our exploration of the Diamond Sutra today, and my talk is going to be geared more towards those who haven't read the sutra yet. So is anyone here who hasn't read it, the Diamond Sutra? Okay, there's at least one. So, hopefully, with the aim of hopefully making it a little more accessible than maybe it sounded from some of the earlier talks, as Kozan noted, there is some language in it that can sound confusing. First of all, because the material is deep, and secondly, because it was a product of its time, and it doesn't always resonate to the modern reader. So hopefully I can make it a little bit less intimidating and maybe supply the impetus for you to read it. So that's the objective. So the first thing is that the presenters this week all agreed to read the Red Pine edition. And so you've been seeing this book quite a bit this week. And it has a fairly meaty, tome-like appearance to it. But the sutra itself is, let's see, the sutra itself is this. It's 27 pages. I mean, it's not a slog. It really isn't. I mean, casual reading, maybe an hour. Close reading, maybe two. I mean, and then you can read it for the rest of your life, I gather. So, this little 27-line sutra, as Roshi mentioned, has inspired something like 100,000 commentaries, and by serious practitioners. So it's clearly, is speaking deeply to people who are deeply trained and have deep practices. So there's something to it. So the name of the sutra, as was mentioned earlier, is the diamond. The full name is the diamond that cuts through illusion. And the word diamond is in the title in Sanskrit is Vajra. But is interested to note that term can also be translated as lightning bolt, oddly enough. So we could also think of it as the lightning bolt that comes through illusion. And I like that. I like that image of a flash of insight, cutting through illusion. And Thich Nhat Hanh points out that people tend to emphasize the diamond in the name, but from his point of view, the cutting through is what's important about this sutra, the cutting through of illusion. So, as was also mentioned, this is an excerpt from a much larger work, as is the Heart Sutra. They're both excerpts from the Mahaprajna Paramita Sutra, a much longer work, whose title means the perfection of wisdom, essentially. If you think about that, the perfection of wisdom, that's a pretty profound title. Sounds like something worth studying. The main themes of the Diamond Sutra are non-permanence, non-self, non-separation, and non-attachment. We see these things come up over and over again in the sutra. And so I mentioned we agreed to read the Red Pine edition, but I want to thank our brother Zuishin, who isn't here, for pointing us also towards Thich Nhat Hanh's translation and his commentary, which is contained in a book of his called Awakening the Heart, the Essential Buddhist Sutras. And that's a collection of 8 or 9 sutras that he says are essential. If you can only study a limited part of the Buddhist canon, those are the ones. He says those are the ones he keeps under his pillow at night. So, and I enjoyed reading the Red Pine version, but I also really enjoyed reading Thich Nhat Hanh's version because he updates the language a little bit, and his commentary, as always, talks about the sutra in action, how it has affected his life, how it is the teachings are employed in his life and have been important, and we can infer from that how they could be important in our life. And also his essential compassion always comes through, and it comes through in the language that he writes with. So I really enjoyed that version, and most of my comment material is coming from the Thich Nhat Hanh version. So the way I want to approach maybe opening this up for people who haven't read it is by exploring two recurring constructs that we see. One of them that Kozan alluded to yesterday, but there are two constructs that I noticed that are repeated over and over and over through the sutra. So, and then hopefully we'll put that all together in a discussion of chapter 25, where both of those constructs co-occur, and we can see them both. And I don't think that's the only chapter where they both occur, but it's a very short chapter. It's about yay. So we'll explore these two constructs a little bit, and then we'll see how they operate within chapter 25. And if I have time, we'll explore a little bit why it might be a good thing to read more than one version of it. Okay. So the first construct that I want to talk about, we first see in chapter 3, very early in the sutra. So the Buddha's talking about beings, and he says, Subhuti, a bodhisattva who creates a perception of a being cannot be called a bodhisattva. And why not? Subhuti, no one can be called a bodhisattva who creates the perception of a self, or who creates the perception of a being, a life, or a soul. So that's the first construct that we see, a self, a being, a life, a soul. We see that over and over and over again in almost every chapter of the sutra. So let's deconstruct that a little bit. So I'm going to use Thich Nhat Hanh's language, and he calls that a self, person, a living being, and a lifespan. So the first element is self, and he kind of defines that as a permanent, changeless identity. So we tend to think of ourselves as having some sort of permanent identity that doesn't change, that is essentially us. I want to talk about the self for a minute. So the self can kind of get a bad rap a little bit in Buddhism, but as Roshi's pointed out before, the psychological self is a necessity. It really is a necessity. We can't operate in the world without it. And by illustration, as I was reading this, I was thinking about, some of the work that I do involves patients with severe disturbances of the self. And this patient that I'm thinking about, who's been on my mind a lot lately, is so disturbed that she's, within the last 2 weeks, she's checked herself into a hospital to undergo electroconvulsive therapy. It used to be called electroshock therapy. That's a pretty last resort kind of thing. So herself has these features where, so it's a catalog of them. Where strong urges are strongly repressed, and that energy is expressed as a symptom. We call that neurosis. We all have some of that, whether we like to admit it or not. And she also has aspects of herself that cannot tolerate other aspects of herself, and they split. We call that dissociation. So along with those internal conflicts, she has conflicts with external reality, and we call that psychosis. So she's got all these things going on. So her self is really not integrated. It's not healthy, and she cannot operate in the world. And her suicidality has gotten to a point where it really is dangerous. And so she's opted to do this, to have electrical current pass through the prefrontal cortex of her brain. That's a pretty extreme treatment. But there are limits to what medication and talk therapy can do for her, and she's hit them. She's hit those limits. So we see that a functioning self is necessary, and there may be an irony here. I'm not 100% sure this is true, but it may be the case that we may need a healthy enough self in order to hear these teachings and see through the self. I was thinking about whether this patient of mine could hear these teachings and work with them. And I don't know what the answer to that is. But my sense is that she's so fragmented and disorganized, and the distortions in her mind are so great that any apprehension in the teachings would probably be similarly distorted. So we need a self. We really do. We need an integrated enough self in order to operate in the world and also to practice. Where we go wrong with the self is when we start thinking of it as permanent, when we start thinking of it as separate from everything else, and when we start thinking of it as changeless. Because those things are just not true. So the fallacy isn't the self itself. It's some of the attributes that we attribute to it. So that's the first of those four things: self, person, living being, lifespan, and that's where the fallacy is. The next one is the notion of a person. And by the way, I should say, so this self, person, living being, lifespan. The Buddha says that these erroneous notions are fundamentally where our suffering comes from. Okay, and that's why they're important. That's why they're repeated. The Buddha keeps pointing that over and over again. These perceptions, these erroneous perceptions, are at the root of our suffering. So we talked about self. Let's talk about person. So the way Thich Nhat Hanh sees this is as kind of like the self, but it connotes non-persons, non-human living creatures. And we make that split. Non-human creatures tend to be devalued, and because they tend to be devalued, they tend to be misused and abused. And that's what our friend Ben is so passionately concerned with, right? Is the non-equal, non-respectful treatment of non-human creatures. And it all comes directly from this fallacious notion of persons. And then the third element in that construct is a living being. So this is also kind of like a self, only here the split is between living and non-living rather than between persons and non-persons. It's between living and non-living. And first of all, we don't really have a crisp definition for life. Nobody can really say what's alive and what's not. And even if we could, the non-living, what we think of as the non-living, beings in the world make living possible. Right? Could you live without salt? Probably not. I mean, literally. So what we think of as the non-living world really is the basis for the living world. So drawing a distinction between them, really, there's no place where one ends and the other begins, really. So any distinction is really conventional. It's not in any sense real. And the fourth element in that first construct is lifespan. And this is a fallacy that we have a birth and a death, and between those events, everything in us is full of life, and that there's no life after our death. And Thich Nhat Hanh points out that our life, our living, starts long before our notional birth, and our notional death is certainly not the end of anything real. And in between, while we think we're totally alive, we're also dying. You know, we're living and dying at the same time. We can't do one without the other. Life and death are one. There's not any separation there. Is completely artificial. You just take a second right now and close your eyes and try to have some sense of the millions of cells in your body that are dying right now. Now they say we turn over all of them every 7 years. But there's no cell in our body that's older than 7 years old. Think about that. And now think about all the millions of cells that are coming into being in your body. So in his talk, Tinsui talked about this flowing quality to things. That everything is in a state of flux all the time, without exception. So if we looked at, that beautiful cherry tree out there in the driveway, we tend to think of, tree, and, as some sort of object. But a physicist might look at that and see mostly empty space and a few subatomic particles running around in a particular pattern. But really what it is a process. The tree is a process. It's never just, as we are never the same between any two heartbeats, the tree is never the same from second to second. The tree is changing while we look at it. It's changing. So the tree is really more of a verb than a noun. We need to look at this linguistically. There are no things. There are no nouns. There's only verbs. There's only process. So there's no persons. There's no selves. There's just processes. And in fact, if we look deeply into that, we'll see that there's really only one process that we tend to refer to as the universe. But maybe we should call that the universing. Give it a dynamic quality to it instead of the universe. Sounds so static to me, and it's nothing. It's anything but, right? So it's these artificial separations that we create. These notions that imply separations and divisions and permanency that lie at the heart of our errors and of our suffering. And then we attach to them, unduly, inappropriately. Is that reasonably clear? That's the first of those constructs. So the second one that we see, I'll go to page This also occurs pretty early. Actually, it might be an earlier occurrence, but I found on page 6. This is chapter 8. This is the one that Kozan had noted in his talk. Buddha Dharmas, Subhuti. Buddha Dharmas are spoken of by the Tathagata as no Buddha Dharmas. Thus they are called Buddha Dharmas. Right? Find another one. Let's see, page. Right here. Bhagavan, they do not find any such Dharma as returning no more. Thus they are said to return no more. So we see this construct over and over again where we say A is no A, thus A is A. And that's really contrary to how we think. Normally we think A is A and not B. Therefore A is A. But the Buddha's saying, or I should say, Thich Nhat Hanh's interpretation of that is that, yes, the tree is the tree. But the tree is also no tree. Because it's, first of all, it's composed of completely non-tree elements. It's composed of energy from the sun, water, carbon, whatever else makes up cellulose, whatever else makes up the chemistry of the tree. All of those things are non-tree. Right? They have no essential identity as tree. And that is true of everything that we can point at, including ourselves. Right? We're completely composed of I am composed of completely non-echo elements. So that's the first issue. The second issue, there's no real demarcation between the tree and the rest of reality. So what the Buddha's one of the things that the Buddha is trying to tell us here is that until we see the tree as no tree, until we see it in its no tree aspects, we don't really see the tree. We see an illusion of the tree. But he sees, the Buddha sees the tree and it's in its full, panoply as no tree as well. Thus he's qualified to say, I see the tree. The rest of us see an illusion of the tree. So if you apply that sort of, logic maybe is the word, or kind of analysis to every time you see that construct in the sutra, it will begin to lead you into what the Buddha's point is in each chapter. So these two constructs. We have the self, person, living being, what was it one? Living being. Thanks. And the construct of negation. A is no A, thus A is A. So if we just take those interpretations and apply them to the sutra, it will help us, give us an entryway into it, I hope. They are not exhaustive. Right? And no one interpretation is going to be exhaustive. This, as I mentioned, this thing inspired 100,000 commentaries. So there are at least that many takes on it. At least. Okay, so now let's put all that together in chapter 25. And I'm going to read Thich Nhat Hanh's version. So that collection, by the way, is available on Kindle for about $17 and in paperback for around $30, I think. So here's section 25, as translated by Thich Nhat Hanh. So, Subhuti, do not say that the Tathagata has the idea, I will bring living beings to the shore of liberation. Do not think that way, Subhuti. Why? In truth, there is not one single being for the Tathagata to bring to the other shore. If the Tathagata were to think there was, he would be caught in the idea of a self, a person, being, or lifespan. Subhuti, what the Tathagata calls a self, essentially has no self, in the way that ordinary persons think there is a self. Subhuti, the Tathagata does not regard anyone as an ordinary person. That is why he can call them ordinary persons. Okay? So we see the two constructs. If the Tathagata were to think that there was a being, he would be caught in the idea of a self, a person, a living being, or a lifespan. And then farther down, the Tathagata does not regard anyone as an ordinary person. That is why he can call them ordinary persons. Because he sees us. He sees us ordinary persons in all our non-personness, with all our connection to the rest of non-separation from the rest of reality. So, how are we doing? So let's contrast that. Now let's talk a little bit about why it might be good to read another translation. So we heard Thich Nhat Hanh's. Now we'll read Red Pines. Subhuti, what do you think? Does it occur to the Tathagata, I rescue beings? Surely, Subhuti, you should hold no such view. And why not? Subhuti, the being does not exist who is rescued by the Tathagata. Subhuti, if any being were rescued by the Tathagata would be attached to a self. He would be attached to a being, attached to a life, attached to a soul. Attachment to a self, Subhuti, is said by the Tathagata to be no attachment, yet foolish people remain attached. And foolish people, Subhuti, are said by the Tathagata to be no people. Thus they are called foolish people. So, it's, first of all, you see the difference in the compassion of language between foolish people and ordinary people. But it seems to me that the Red Pine version emphasizes the unreality of the attachment, whereas the Thich Nhat Hanh version emphasizes maybe the unreality of the notional person. They're not really different, but they're nuanced, and the nuances strongly affect how we apprehend the sutra. So anyway, I hope that was reasonably clear. In his commentary, Thich Nhat Hanh points out that implicit in the Buddha's discussion of foolish people is his awareness that as no people, as fundamental parts of reality, as not separated from himself or anything else, these people are a thought or a flash away from Buddhahood. There's no distinction. So, I think that's it. I'll stop there. So I hope that will help introduce the sutra to anyone who hasn't read it and give you a little, at least the beginning guidance on how to approach it without being intimidated by the potentially confusing language. So if that helps, then I'm happy. Thank you for your attention.